Hello, welcome to It's Not Your Money, real talk about achieving racial equity in philanthropy. Hosted by Camelback Ventures, these frank conversations feature leaders challenging the status quo plaguing philanthropy today, and also those who are demonstrating how we can collectively build a more equitable and just funding landscape, particularly for organizations and businesses led by Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, women, and non-binary founders. I'm Jessamyn Shams-Lau, Senior Advisor to the Capital Collaborative by Camelback Ventures, and your host today. I spent a decade leading a California family foundation, advocating for philanthropy with humility, and co-authored the book Unicorns Unite: How Nonprofits and Foundations Build Epic Partnerships. And I am super excited today to talk with Katherine Milligan and John Kania from the Collective Change Lab. Collective Change Lab is a think tank focused on transformational collective change, where Katherine is a director, and previously she was also the executive director of the Schwab Foundation for Social Entrepreneurship, sister organization to the World Economic Forum, and where John is founder and executive director. Prior to that, he also ran FSG, a nonprofit consulting firm and think tank. And he also co-authored Stanford Social Innovation Review's, that's a mouthful, that one, Stanford Social Innovation Review's most read article ever called Collective Impact. I'm never going to be in that position, John, but if that were me, I would be like, what do I follow that up with? John and Katherine, please tell us a bit more about yourselves.
Well, thank you so much for having us here. First of all, it's really a thrill. About me, I've always been passionate about, equity and development issues. I'm a dual national, originally American, living in Europe, specifically Switzerland, for almost 2 decades now. A mom of 3, and like everybody else, trying to juggle all the roles. So I know we'll get into it in just a moment, but it's a real pleasure to be in conversation with you, Jessamyn.
Thanks, Katherine.
And so I'm a father of 3 20-somethings who are constantly telling me things that I don't know. So that's a good learning process. I've been a teacher, a researcher, writer, and practitioner of social change for the last 20 years. And for me, the passion in the work is really about supporting, I like to call them, the people in the soup. Those that are actually doing the real hard work of social change. And my passion is anything that I can do to contribute to helping them do better, be better leaders in the work they do. And for kicks, I'm a biker and a hiker.
Nice. Well, it seems like you both wear a lot of hats. And obviously, we're going to dive into some very particular hats that you wear. But before we do that, I would love to just quickly talk about language, because one of the reasons this series is called It's Not Your Money is because when we incorrectly label the money in foundations and donor advised funds as still belonging to the founders of those organizations, then we also then act like the money and the foundation still belong to them, which then perpetuates this concentration of power that philanthropy has trouble with. So words are super important. And I'd love to ask Katherine, tell me, what shift in language do you think that we might need to make in order to advance more equity and justice in the world?
Yeah, I love this question. It's so fun and creative. And a couple of things come top of mind. And the first is this notion of, driving social change. I feel like, we hear that term a lot, and I think that's problematic. It's elitist, and, as a funder, assumes that maybe you're the person who should be in the driver's seat. And then what does that mean? Everyone else is the passenger. But change comes from the community, of course. And, we don't drive it. We can support that change, facilitate it, resource it, midwife it, but not drive it. So that's, kind of one. And another is, sort of scaling impact. And then this phrase is everywhere. How do you scale your impact? We've scaled our impact 10 times. It's so ubiquitous. It's lost its meaning a bit. And I think, sure, yes, attaining scale is an appropriate objective in certain cases for social problems that are relatively simple and bounded and where a proven solution exists. But I do think that, kind of our collective, obsessive focus on scale obscures what we see it as CCL as a larger truth, which is, that scaling a single point intervention on its own will never transform a system to be just and equitable for all. It'll just produce incremental gains. And so that leads me to my, third and last, which is sort of a term or word, which is transformation. And, that's a really important word. And I think, it does capture what our aim should be, right? To transform, but it's increasingly misused. These systems around us, education systems, our healthcare systems, our housing systems, et cetera, are not transforming into systems that are just and equitable, right? We're making incremental gains, but transformation is literally turning something into something else, and that's clearly not happening even as we toss around the term more and more. So yeah, those are just a few top of mind examples.
Oh, I really appreciate those, Katherine. I really like how each of those examples are kind of focused on how reductive our language tends to be. We're overly simplifying things with these buzzwords that we love to throw around and not acknowledging the complexity of the work that we're involved in. And I think that robs us of a lot of different things. It robs us of fully grasping the enormity of the work that we need to put forth, and the size of resources that we might need to actually make change. But also perhaps it almost kind of robs us of this of an opportunity to celebrate that we really are doing incredibly hard things, complex, complicated things. But when we just reduce it to numbers that we label impact, it's very easy to just tick the box and move along, which is a shame. Thank you. I appreciate that, Katherine. John, over to you. Tell us a bit more about the genesis of the Collective Change Lab, and particularly why you decided to make equity and justice a focus of your work in general there.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Jessamyn. So Collective Change Lab was founded really coming out of my 20 years of working in the social sector. And a decade of that, the last decade, has been helping to birth the global movement around collective impact. And we define collective impact as multi-sector efforts to create population-level change. So what I was seeing in that work, and it really, it's quite an honor to be doing that work and to be working in communities with players who are interested in creating change, was, the real power. We say, if you want to change the system, get the system in the room. And collective impact does a good job of that. By getting the system in the room, we're talking about getting representation of all the various players who touch an issue. And I was seeing the power of that, but ironically, I was also seeing in this work that the collective work was not always geared towards equity and justice. Much of it was about incrementalism, about sort of, in some respects, maintaining the status quo, and that, which continues to hold back certain groups. So we're not getting where we want to go, at least I think many of us want to go in the direction of equity and justice. And what I wanted to focus on in my work was how do we transform systems through shifting power and changing social norms and mental models that are, the source of inequities and injustices. And so that's where the work of Collective Change Lab lies, in this transformational area.
Brilliant. Thank you. Well, you are clearly I was about to use a word that Katherine just vetoed for us. I was about to say, you're clearly a driving force in the conversation and in the work of systems change, and I fell into the trap. So
our hope is Katherine also used the word midwife, and I actually kind of like that.
A midwife.
A midwife, that you're helping and you're supporting. You're not the one who's actually doing it.
Yes.
And it's probably, it's for another conversation, but frankly, I feel like part of what we need to do from a language standpoint is move from the masculine language to the feminine. And that what's really out of balance right now in society, we need both the masculine and the feminine, but is we need to bring the feminine more back in play. So I'll go with midwife for now, as opposed to driver.
I love it. I love it. John Kania, systems change midwife.
I like it.
On the way. Okay, so let's get into trauma, because that's what we're talking about today, particularly. So in the social change sector, in the world at large, we're increasingly talking about addressing racial equity and justice, but those conversations and actions, they usually highly focused on evening the playing field or creating new rules. That are both very forwards looking discussions and activities. And I think that what we don't often give enough time to, particularly in our white dominant work culture, is acknowledging trauma and the healing that has to occur in order to move forward. So it's kind of that moment to stand in where we are now, but also look back and reflect on what's already happened. And I was really, really intrigued to learn that trauma is a topic that the Collective Change Lab is focusing on. In fact, it's one of the guiding questions that your team is explicitly exploring. How do we heal from trauma and integrate collective healing practices into the work of systems change? So given our audience, and that we're particularly talking about philanthropy, I would be so interested to hear how you would articulate how we see trauma show up in philanthropy. Like, how does it show up both in the process of philanthropy, but also potentially how does it show up in the outcomes of philanthropy too?
Such a good question. And one of the things, and you're right, this is a major initiative for CCL, together with our partners, the Wellbeing Project at Georgetown University and many others who are contributing to this effort, including incredible social change leaders in the suit, as John said, who are sharing their time and their wisdom with us. And it feels really important to acknowledge their contribution. And so one of the things I've learned is that this is so overwhelming and so complex and so nuanced. So I'm not remotely going to do it justice in the time that we have. Let me just give, I think, three, kind of quick examples to help us see the contours a little bit. And then, there are opportunities to potentially go deeper. And the first is really, how does it show up? Actually, I flip that around and say the first way it shows up is by its glaring absence. It's actually very rarely part of the social change conversation, including in the conversations between funders and grantees, or funders and implementing partners. So whatever language is used, there's still a lot of stigma and denial about its existence and the prevalence of it. And what we found, actually, especially when we're talking to those who are farther removed from communities in pain, is that people get uncomfortable pretty quickly and try and change topics, or they'll nod like they get it, like, yeah, but they don't really get it. They're nodding, but you can see they're just like, what are these people talking about? Right. And then they'll try and steer the conversation onto safer ground. And there's no blame here. Many of us do not know how to have these conversations. We all have a common language around trauma, and we're afraid of saying the wrong thing. And, again, some of us kind of farther removed and, from places of privilege, possibly we don't even, kind of really see it. So that's one way. And I think a related way, but I've come to appreciate this more deeply, that it can show up, is a refusal to, and you just talked about this, Jessamyn, a refusal to excavate the past, right? To look at history, to acknowledge what has come before. Kind of like, forget about that. We just want to move forward. Yes. That's pretty common too. But, as Monique Miles, the, kind of managing director at the community, the Aspen Institute for Community Solutions, shared with us recently, in talking about her work, moving systems towards equity and justice, first and foremost, means understanding history. And then you need to understand the different ways that people have connected to and intersected with that history, and how that history has impacted the lived experiences of people who are dealing with the issues that you're trying to change. And that means understanding trauma. So that's the second. And the third, and kind of then I'll stop there. The third way it shows up is it can be performative. Movements, organizations, nonprofits, in some senses, not, of course, not always, but sometimes. And we've heard this from many social, folks have to perform their trauma, have to demonstrate in a way how their suffering is more worthy than these other causes. And that retelling can be harmful. It can be re-triggering. The CEO of a well-known social sector think tank told us that, there's growing momentum around this idea that people who have experience with an issue should tell their stories, and that feels righteous to people in power. But sometimes, power also is in not telling your story, right, so that you can avoid the re-traumatization in the retelling, right? And so, even they in their relatively privileged role have had to push back sometimes on funders and say, no, these people don't want to tell their stories, and we need to be respectful of that. So, there are examples and stories. In one of our articles, we featured an organization called United for Brownsville, and I think, the other way it shows up is, of course, how is it that we think about supporting, equipping, building the leadership capacity, and development of the people in communities doing the work that John was talking about earlier, engaging with the other parts of the system in the room. Because by definition, that means there are going to be representatives of institutions and agencies in that room who have caused your family or, kind of your friend group trauma in the past or even in the present. So if we're asking, those with lived experience and those in communities to step up into leadership roles, how is it that we are thinking about supporting them, right, in the ways that they're doing the work? Where's the budget line item that's helping them heal, so that they can engage with those decision makers and institutional power holders in a constructive way, in a way that they don't feel re-triggered, that feels that they can hold on to their humanity as well. So I'll stop there.
There's a lot in there, Katherine, and I think it's like it makes me remember that this work of philanthropy, like a lot of people believe that philanthropy is very easy, right? You are writing checks and giving away money, right, is often how it is seen. And I think what you're reminding us here is that if we're going to do this right, like there have to be layers of intentionality, there have to be layers of learning to this profession, right? This is not something we just turn up to do because it's our job or because it's a family responsibility or whatever. Like there's like deep impact into every stakeholder's life when you're coming into the process of philanthropy and coming into contact with representatives or symbols or organizations that potentially have caused trauma in your community. And to do that in a way that holds people, that cares for them, that's an incredibly hard job. And I think we have to almost like take that process a little bit more seriously in order to show up in the ways that you're talking about, to take those history lessons, and to really think about all of the nuance involved in the way we ask people to show up as the funders with the power, and we're asking other people to show up in our spaces. John, I see you nodding. Was there anything you wanted to add there?
Well, I think you're characterizing beautifully, the challenge, and I would say for myself going forward and looking back, 5 to 7 years ago, this really wasn't on my radar screen
Mm.
as critical and essential to doing the work of philanthropy and doing the work of social change. The way I feel today, and I'm still just a beginner, is I can't imagine anything more important that we need to understand in the social sector and that philanthropy needs to understand. If we're really serious and intent on supporting what are the issues we're trying to address, whether it's in education or healthcare or homelessness or climate change, I think we're really coming to and it is a bit of a wokeness that this is at the core of really any social or environmental issue, trauma, and for philanthropy to get serious about this, and we all need to just as for many philanthropies, you go back 10 to 12 years ago, racial equity was kind of there, but it wasn't something that they internalized and brought into their organization and did the hard work. And I think we're in a similar and related stage when it comes to trauma.
Yeah.
And healing.
Mm. Thank you, John. Okay, so I'm going to move us along and staying on the topic of trauma, though. So kind of to some of the points that you've raised already, trauma is this really big, heavy word. We're kind of like afraid of it in a lot of ways, and understandably so, because it covers a multitude of experiences and suffering, really. Like, it doesn't just refer to one type of human tragedy, it refers to all sorts of very heavy, difficult life experiences. So when we think about philanthropy, and Katherine, you mentioned some of this in your previous answers, but what types of trauma are we talking about specifically when we look at the system of philanthropy? And particularly if our goal is to move philanthropy towards equity and justice, like, are there types of trauma within that system that are more important for us to address and to focus on first? And lastly, just to throw another one in there, how do you think we figure out where to start that conversation as well?
Yeah, well, good questions. So I want to begin to answer your question with a few definitions of what we've learned in the course of our work about you asked about the types of trauma. And this is one way to sort of start to say, yes, there are layers. And as you point out, it encompasses, the whole of the human experience. But many trauma experts typically talk about three types of trauma: individual, ancestral, and collective. Just very quickly, sort of what are those? Individual trauma is trauma that happens to you as the unique human being that you are. For example, you unexpectedly lose a parent or somebody who's close to you, or the environment you grew up in wasn't safe. These events cause mind, body, spirit impacts on you that are unique to your situation. That's individual trauma. Then there's ancestral trauma. Ancestral trauma is a traumatic event that occurred in the past in your family, and it influences you in the present, even if you didn't have direct experience with the traumatic event. So just a quick example, if my great-grandparents lived through the Irish potato famine in 1850 and then emigrated to the United States, and then years later, after my family is well established, I might still have a great fear of running out of food, even though I'm 3 generations removed from the time of the potato famine.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm experiencing ancestral trauma. And then collective trauma refers to sort of mind, body, spirit reactions to a traumatic event that affects a whole group. And experts talk about 2 types of collective trauma. One is collective trauma at an identity or group level. So sort of a caste, class, religious. So the Holocaust, slavery, genocide of indigenous peoples, that would be collective trauma at an identity group level. Then there's collective trauma at a whole society level, like an earthquake, war, famine, World War II, the crisis in Yemen, Ukraine. That's trauma at a whole society level. So, trauma, Einstein once said, everything should be made as possible, or made as simple as possible, but not simpler. This is even talking about trauma as individual, ancestral, and collective. There's just so much more to know about it. But at least that starts to, help you understand that there are a variety of things going on here. And I think the reality is that philanthropy, we could say through no fault of anybody, but philanthropy is not really addressing any of these at any sort of, in the mainstream, at any sort of large capacity. There are obviously some visionary players out there. But I think, where to start the conversation is right here, which is just for all of us to get better educated, understand, they call it trauma informed. And, just as if you think again, like the racial equity movement, it took a lot of real sort of understanding and, sort of internal understanding of what this is about before you could even, start to do it at sort of a deep level in your philanthropic work. And again, I think we're on that same sort of path here. We're very, very early. The thing that I think Katherine and I, have found in this work, because we started out by saying we think this is really important, but we don't know a lot about it because we're not close to experts. First of all, we brought an expert in. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention Dr. Laura Calderon de la Barca, who is a Mexican psychotherapist and collective healing expert. And she's been, a real sort of valuable resource and partner for us. And we've also just met so many incredible people along the way in the trauma and healing world that aren't right now connected up to philanthropy. So it can be overwhelming if you say we have to do it ourselves, which sometimes philanthropy does, but we don't. There's a whole world out there. And part of what we're hoping to do is bridge these worlds together.
That's pretty exciting. And I think also reassuring.
Yeah, right?
Any program officers or executive directors of foundations that are like, yes, this is important. Oh boy, where do I go? And actually, let's stay on that practical note right now. If funders listening today were going to walk away with only one or two actions in mind about how they can move philanthropy towards a place of trauma acknowledgement that enables racial equity and racial justice, what is it that you would urge funders to prioritize?
So, yeah, I'm happy to start, and then, John, if there's anything you'd like to add. I guess my first message really is, there's no way around it other than through it. I just don't see how we're going to step into a future where all humans can flourish in a flourishing natural world that sustains us unless we truly heal from these collective traumas that have weighed us down for generations. And so, that means that we need to be willing to see, to acknowledge. That's really the first step, and name the trauma that's living in plain sight, really, or hiding in plain sight. And I think, the thing that we've heard from many of the social sector leaders, these, wonderful visionary folks that John referred to earlier, is that they see it, they sense it, they experience it, they observe it, they know it's there, but they almost don't feel that they have permission to say it out loud, or don't have anyone that they can say it to. It's one of them told us, like, there's no one I can have this conversation with. So it's really challenging for them to convey how trauma shows up as a force to be reckoned with in the work that they're doing, how it hinders progress to other key stakeholders who are farther removed, right? Like funders and like boards. And so, one message I have is being mindful of these performative dynamics that I talked about earlier. Yes, of course, but initiate a conversation with the community leaders that you support and begin asking, create that safe space and begin asking those questions, which is directly tied to my second recommendation, because these conversations are scary. They can take us out of our comfort zone quickly. And so that means that we have to be doing our own trauma work on our own past wounds, on the defenses that we built to protect ourselves from our own kind of the personal biography trauma that John was talking about, in order to be able to be fully present and fully attuned to what's happening in the conversation, and also inside of me. What is this bringing up for me? And third, I would just say, that some of the most forward-thinking funders we spoke with, so one way to start the conversation is by asking those leaders, what does collective healing look like to you and your community? And not be prescriptive about it, but, to emphasize the collective, because what we heard across the board is that investing in relationships is a key part of the solution, right? So, collective healing allows us to tap into the healing power of relationships, and healing relationships really holds, I think, a big part of the key. So what that means for a funder is that takes time to do. It has to be part of someone's job description, and it's not a distraction from the work. Like deliver on the strategy and hit the KPIs, and that's kind of, it's a core part of the work. So rather than kind of strip that out of funding proposals and budgets as a nice to have, how can you as a funder like prioritize those investments and invite them, ask for them, allocate resources to them. So those would be a couple of places to start.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Katherine. And we'll make sure that we also pop those in the chat for people as nice handy dandy takeaways. So we are coming towards the end of our time in this conversation, and I would love for us to just end thinking about the future. So, John, if I can ask you, if your dreams were realized for the way we approach our work in the social change sector, and funders took those steps that Katherine outlined, how do you believe philanthropy-driven systems change could look different, let's say 25 years from now?
Well, you gave me 25 years, which is a long time. So I got to get far out. I think one of the things that we're learning through this work, and if one has experienced trauma at a fairly deep level and been lucky enough to go through some process of going from trauma to integrating that trauma to beginning to heal, it is amazing what happens. You go from being stuck and not knowing how to go forward to being unstuck. We as a society are stuck, and we are carrying, and systems carry, all sorts of trauma. 25 years out, I would hope that we, as philanthropy becomes trauma informed, as addressing and working with trauma, and also supporting the processes of healing, collective healing, as those start to take hold, I think we will see creativity, because the wonderful thing is getting to the other side is you start to see things that you don't see now. So, let's take climate change. I am fully convinced that we would start to see things we don't see now. And in some respects, I think we'd probably be a lot less reliant on technology as the answer in climate change and other things that more are about ourselves. But I think the real opportunity here is getting to a point where we're integrating, where the trauma gets surfaced, it gets integrated, and it's starting to heal, not only at an individual level, but at a collective level. And when we get to that point, I am fully confident, and here I go. I have faith I do have faith that we will see different answers, and different answers will come to us than we are seeing now. I mean, if you want to talk, again, we'll go back to the word, systems-driven philanthropy. Philanthropy does not drive systems. The best you can do if you want to support systems change as a philanthropy, it's to support the community in a capacity to heal itself. And if you can do that, you will build resilience into a system that can take on new challenges and learn to overcome them themselves. They don't need you. And I think that's where I'd love to see this head.
That was beautiful. Oh my gosh. I'm just like, yes, this is the future we all want. I know, yeah. I know that everybody, at least all of the colleagues that I have met in philanthropy, this is what we want. And I really, really appreciate the messages that you've shared today, that the invitation to reflect on our own trauma and how that might be showing up in the way we're turning up in our place in this system of funding, but also the reminder that there's no other way than through it, and that is permission giving in and of itself, like, you know what, I shouldn't waste my energy on trying to avoid this or go around it. I'm just going to do it. And more than anything, just this focus and practical advice to ask community what collective healing looks like for them. I think that is just beautifully put, and I really, really hope it's something that our audience is able to think about as they continue to go about their work serving the communities that they do. Excuse me, we are out of time, unfortunately, but viewers, you can check out more on Katherine and John's work at collectivechangelab.org. And that's where you can also find updates on forthcoming publications like this, trauma that we've been talking about today, but also many other topics that they're focused on too. Please also check out the Capital Collaborative Program by Camelback Ventures. The program helps white funders deepen their commitment and efforts to advance racial equity and racial justice through their work in philanthropy and impact investing. And we are accepting applications now for the next cohort. You can find more information online at camelbackventures.org. That is everything that we have for you today. Thank you so much, Katherine and John. I wish we had a few more hours to dig into all of this, but that's where we have to end today. And just thank our viewers as well for tuning in and listening too.
Oh, thank you so much, Jessamyn, for holding such a beautiful conversation and for bringing us to such a meaningful close. I really appreciate it, and I really appreciate everyone who listened today. So thank you so much for being a part of the conversation too.
Our pleasure.